3 destroyers were lost in 20 minutes, but Vella Gulf was not the end of Japan's night war. It was the beginning of a pattern. In the weeks following August 6, 1943, nothing dramatic appeared to change on the surface. Japanese destroyers still sailed. American destroyers still patrolled. The Solomon Islands remained a grinding contest of logistics and positioning. There was no formal announcement declaring that control of the night had shifted. Naval warfare does not change that way. Instead, change reveals itself through repetition. And repetition is what followed Vella Gulf. The most immediate lesson was quiet but clear. American destroyers, operating alone, using radar deliberately and firing torpedoes first, could dictate the terms of a night engagement. That model did not disappear after August 6th. It was refined. Only weeks later, American forces again encountered Japanese surface units under cover of darkness. The engagements varied in scale and circumstance, but the structure was increasingly familiar. Radar contact at range, silent approach, torpedoes launched before gunfire, measured withdrawal. What had once been a defensive reaction became a controlled offensive tactic. The significance was not that the Japanese suddenly became ineffective. They continued to fight with skill and discipline. The significance was that American destroyers were no longer reacting to Japanese initiative. They were anticipating it. In November 1943, at the Battle of Empress Augusta Bay, the pattern sharpened further. American radar once again provided early warning. Coordination between destroyer divisions improved. Gunfire and torpedoes were used with restraint rather than urgency. The battle was more complex than Vella Gulf, involving cruisers and larger formations, but the underlying reality remained. Darkness no longer guaranteed Japanese surprise. The American advantage in detection was now systematic, not accidental. Then, in late November 1943, came Cape St. George. By that point, the adaptation that began before Vella Gulf had matured. American destroyers again operated independently, again relied on radar, and again executed torpedo attacks that caught Japanese ships before they could fully respond. The results were not identical to Vella Gulf, but the operational confidence was. There was no sense of improvisation, no sense of desperate reaction. Instead, there was method. Vella Gulf had been the first clean demonstration. Cape St. George confirmed it was repeatable. It is important to understand what this pattern represented. It did not mean that Japanese sailors had lost their skill. It did not mean that the Type 93 torpedo was suddenly obsolete. It meant that the environment in which those strengths operated had changed. In 1942, darkness had amplified Japanese advantages. In late 1943, darkness had become neutral ground. Radar removed uncertainty. Reliable American torpedoes restored credibility to destroyer attacks. And perhaps most significantly, American commanders had learned patience. Patience at night is a force multiplier. At Vella Gulf, Commander Frederick Moosbrugger resisted the instinct to fire guns as soon as radar detected contact. That restraint allowed torpedoes to strike without warning. In subsequent engagements, similar restraint appeared again. It became habit. Habit becomes doctrine. Doctrine becomes expectation, and expectation shapes behavior. For the Japanese Navy, the consequences were subtle but persistent. Destroyer commanders could no longer assume that speed and darkness alone would provide initiative. Supply runs grew riskier. Operational planning required new caution. Every movement at night carried the possibility that radar contact had already been made, silently. This altered tempo, and tempo matters. In naval warfare, the side that dictates tempo often dictates outcome. By late 1943, American destroyers increasingly controlled when and how night battles began. That had not been true a year earlier. There is another layer to this pattern: industrial momentum. By 1943, American shipyards were launching new destroyers at a rate Japan could not match. Even if the tactical situation had remained equal, the strategic imbalance was widening. But Vella Gulf and the battles that followed demonstrated that the imbalance was not only quantitative, it was qualitative. American destroyers were improving in coordination, equipment, and doctrine at the same time they were increasing in number. Japan, facing fuel shortages and growing strain on trained personnel, had less room to experiment or revise. Adaptation requires time. Time requires resources. Resources were becoming scarce. The pattern after Vella Gulf also signaled something broader about the Pacific War. The early phase of the conflict had featured dramatic Japanese tactical superiority in night surface combat. That superiority had shaped American caution. It had shaped fleet deployment decisions. It had shaped morale. By late 1943, those assumptions were dissolving. When assumptions dissolve, strategy must adjust. American commanders grew more willing to operate aggressively at night. Japanese commanders grew more aware that darkness offered no guarantee. The shift was not theatrical. There was no single declaration that the night now belongs to America. Instead, there was a series of engagements in which radar detection, torpedo discipline, and coordinated maneuvering produced consistent results. Consistency defines patterns, patterns define trends, and trends define outcomes. Looking back, historians sometimes search for dramatic turning points, singular battles that altered the course of the war. Vella Gulf was not Midway. It was not Leyte Gulf. It did not involve aircraft carriers or massive fleets, but it revealed something crucial. The United States Navy had learned how to fight effectively in an environment that once favored its opponent. Once that lesson was absorbed, it could not be unlearned. Every subsequent night, engagement carried that knowledge forward. By the end of 1943, the cumulative effect was unmistakable. Japanese destroyer forces continued to operate. They continued to resist. But they no longer entered the night with the presumption of advantage. They entered it knowing the other side could see, and that knowledge alters risk calculations. It shortens operational reach. It reduces aggressiveness. It introduces hesitation. In war, hesitation compounds. The 4 destroyers that entered Vella Gulf on August 6th did not know they were participating in the beginning of a pattern. They believed they were conducting another routine supply run, dangerous but familiar. Only one returned. The immediate loss was 3 ships. The larger shift was structural. After Vella Gulf, American destroyers did not merely win a battle, they demonstrated a method. And once a method proves repeatable, it becomes the foundation of future action. The darkness over the Solomon Islands did not change. The sea remained the same. What changed was who understood how to operate within it. From that point forward, Japan no longer possessed an unquestioned edge in night surface warfare, not because of a single explosion, but because a pattern had begun, and it would continue.
That morning, the American invasion at Leyte nearly collapsed. When Admiral Halsey turned north to destroy the Japanese carriers, he believed he was striking at the heart of the enemy's remaining naval power. He did not know that behind him, a far more dangerous force was already moving. During the night of October 24th, Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita had taken his powerful center force through the San Bernardino Strait. Battleships, heavy cruisers, destroyers, including Yamato, the largest battleship ever built. At dawn on October 25th, that force emerged into the waters off the island of Samar. What Kurita expected to find were vulnerable American transports inside Leyte Gulf. What he actually encountered was something smaller, but still directly in his path. A group of American escort carriers and destroyers known as Taffy 3. They were not fleet carriers. They were not fast battleships. These were escort carriers, slow, lightly armored ships designed to support landings and provide air cover. Their destroyers were built for screening and anti-submarine duty, not for engaging capital ships. And now, on the horizon, towering silhouettes began to appear. Moments later, enormous columns of water erupted around the American ships. Kurita's heavy guns had opened fire. The first salvos were unmistakable. Massive shells, some weighing more than a ton, screamed overhead and crashed into the sea, throwing up walls of spray. The shockwaves rolled across the smaller American vessels. Signal flags snapped in the wind. Deck crews froze for a split second as the realization set in. This was not a skirmish. They were facing a battleship fleet. On board the escort carriers, aircraft were already warming up for routine support missions. Now they were launched in emergency conditions. Some carried anti-submarine bombs. Some were barely armed at all. But there was no time to rearm properly. Every plane that could fly was sent into the air. The destroyers did something even more remarkable. Instead of fleeing, they turned towards the enemy. Through smoke screens and incoming fire, American destroyers charged directly at Kurita's formation. Their guns were smaller, their armor was thin, but they had speed and torpedoes. As they closed the distance, shells rained around them. Steel tore, fires broke out. Men were thrown from their feet. Yet the attacks continued. Torpedoes were launched at close range, forcing Japanese cruisers and battleships to turn away to avoid them. Even when torpedoes missed, they disrupted formations. They created hesitation. Above, American pilots attacked relentlessly. Dive bombers screamed down on heavy cruisers. Torpedo planes made repeated runs, sometimes without live torpedoes, simply to force evasive maneuvers. Machine guns strafed decks. Smoke covered the sea. To Kurita, the situation began to look different than expected. He had anticipated scattered resistance, perhaps the rear guard of a much larger fleet. Instead, he was under constant air attack. Ships were maneuvering aggressively. Torpedoes were incoming. From his bridge, the battlefield looked chaotic. Meanwhile, desperate radio messages were flying south. Vice Admiral Thomas Kincaid, commanding the U.S. 7th Fleet, believed Halsey's battleships were guarding the strait. They were not. Kincaid requested immediate support. Far away to the north, aboard the battleship USS New Jersey, Admiral Halsey received updates. Then came a message from Pacific Fleet headquarters. It asked a simple question about the location of Task Force 34, the fast battleships many assumed were blocking Kurita. Due to standard encryption procedures, extra words had been added to confuse potential enemy interceptors. When the message was decoded aboard New Jersey, those filler words were not removed cleanly. Among them was a phrase that read, "The world wonders." In the middle of an unfolding crisis, with ships under fire and information incomplete, Halsey interpreted the message as criticism, perhaps even sarcasm. Accounts later described him reacting with visible anger. But the reality was more complex than 3 stray words. Halsey was under immense pressure. He had committed his main strength northward. He believed he was finishing off Japan's carrier threat. Now he was being told that heavy Japanese ships were attacking vulnerable American forces to the south. Time could not be rewound. At Samar, the fighting continued. One American escort carrier was hit and badly damaged. Destroyers took punishing fire. Some would not survive the day. Yet the resistance did not collapse. The relentless air attacks, even when lightly armed, created the impression of a far stronger American presence. Smoke screens obscured visibility. Torpedo wakes forced sudden turns. Gradually, uncertainty crept into Kurita's calculations. He did not know exactly what lay ahead inside Leyte Gulf. He had already lost cruisers the day before in earlier engagements. His ships had endured submarine attacks and airstrikes. Now, instead of catching defenseless transports, he faced aggressive opposition and continuous air harassment. Shortly before midday, Kurita made a decision that historians still debate. He ordered his force to withdraw. The powerful Japanese battleships and cruisers turned away from Samar and began moving back towards the strait. Taffy 3, battered, smoking, and blooded, was still afloat. The American invasion at Leyte had survived its most dangerous hour. Only later would the scale of what had nearly happened become clear. A narrow window had opened in the American defensive line. A powerful surface fleet had passed through it, and a small group of escort carriers and destroyers had stood directly in its path. In the north, Halsey eventually ordered his battleships southward. But by then, Kurita was already retreating. The trap had worked, but not as cleanly as Japan had hoped. And as afternoon faded toward evening, the northern skies were still echoing with explosions. Ozawa's carriers were gone, but scattered across the sea were damaged ships, survivors in the water, and one final act of resistance that would unfold after sunset. Before the day ended, a lone Japanese destroyer would make a stand against overwhelming odds. And with that, the last chapter of Japan's carrier era would close. 4 carriers were gone. By late afternoon on October 25th, 1944, the smoke over the Philippine Sea hung low and heavy. The northern sky had gone quiet. 4 Japanese carriers were gone. But the sea itself was not finished with the day. Scattered across the horizon were damaged ships, drifting debris, and men in the water. The once proud northern force under Vice Admiral Ozawa was no longer a carrier fleet. It was a collection of survivors trying to escape. And yet, even in defeat, there was one final act. As the sun began to sink, American surface ships, cruisers and destroyers pushed forward to hunt what remained. Radar contacts appeared. Silhouettes formed against the darkening sky. Among them was the Japanese destroyer Hatsuzuki. She was not large. She was not heavily armored. She carried no air group, no strategic value equal to the carriers already lost. But she had orders: protect the retreat, cover the survivors. When American cruisers closed in, Hatsuzuki did not turn away. Instead, she turned towards them. In the fading light, gun flashes lit the horizon. American heavy cruisers opened fire first. Shells landed around the destroyer, sending columns of water high into the air. Within moments, the sea between them was alive with explosions. Hatsuzuki answered back. Her guns were smaller, her firepower limited, but she maneuvered aggressively, zigzagging through the splashes, buying time. For nearly 2 hours, she held the attention of a far stronger force. It was not a battle she could win. It was a delay she was ordered to create. Eventually, repeated hits tore into her hull. Fires spread. Systems failed. As darkness deepened, the destroyer slowed, then stopped. When she finally sank, only a handful of her crew survived. It was the last surface engagement of Ozawa's broken fleet. Further north, another damaged Japanese ship, the light cruiser Tama, tried to limp away under cover of night. She would not make it. An American submarine detected her and launched torpedoes. Within minutes, Tama slipped beneath the surface. By nightfall, the northern force had ceased to exist as an effective unit. But the significance of that day went beyond the loss of individual ships. For years, aircraft carriers had defined the Pacific War. In December 1941, carriers had struck Pearl Harbor. At Coral Sea and Midway, carriers had decided the balance of power. In the long campaign across the Pacific, carriers had been the spearhead of every advance. They were the center of naval strategy. Now, on October 25th, 1944, Japan's carrier arm was effectively finished. 4 carriers lost in one day. The last operational fleet carrier gone. Thousands of trained sailors and air crew dead. Japan still possessed ships. It still possessed courage. It still possessed the will to fight. But it no longer possessed the means to contest American air superiority at sea. From this point forward, American carriers would operate with overwhelming dominance. The road to Iwo Jima, the road to Okinawa, the tightening ring around the Japanese home islands, all would unfold in the shadow of Leyte Gulf. And there is one more irony. Leyte Gulf is remembered as the largest naval battle in history. It is remembered for the crisis at Samar. It is remembered for controversy and courage alike. But it also marked the end of something larger. The great carrier duels of the Pacific were over. No future battle would pit carrier fleet against carrier fleet on that scale again. The Japanese Navy would never again assemble such a force. The era that had begun with surprise airstrikes and bold carrier warfare was closing. Less than a year later, an entirely different kind of weapon would redefine naval power and global war in ways no admiral in 1944 could fully imagine. But on that October evening, the meaning was already clear. The Imperial Japanese Navy had gambled everything. It had used its last carriers as bait. It had nearly broken through at Samar. And in the end, it had lost the very instrument that once made it feared across the Pacific. When the sea finally grew quiet that night, it carried with it more than wreckage. It carried the end of Japan's carrier fleet, and with it, the final turning point of naval power in the Pacific War.